Most stories don't fail because they're badly written. They fail because they break a promise. Every story makes one. A horror story promises fear, a mystery promises answers, and romance promises emotional payoff. Audiences are surprisingly good at sensing when that promise gets broken. Maybe you've watched a show that started with a fascinating mystery, only to abandon it for endless action scenes. Or perhaps a fantasy that began with wonder and discovery before turning into power levels and world-ending threats. The individual pieces might still be good. The action might even be better, the stakes much higher. But the thing that got you invested in the first place slowly disappears. That's why I want to talk about Hat Atelier, because I think it's one of the rare fantasy stories that understands exactly what promise it's making, and more importantly, why it's delivering on it. Before we can talk about whether a story succeeds, we need to understand what it's trying to do. And I don't think Hat Atelier is primarily trying to impress us with its plot, or its action, or even its world building. Its promise is much simpler than that. It's promising wonder. From the opening moments, the story invites us to see magic the way Coco sees it. Not as a weapon, not as a resource, not even as a system to master, but as something extraordinary. Something worth pursuing simply because it exists. That's the emotional contract. The story is essentially saying, "Come with me, and I'll show you something magical." The question is whether it can maintain that feeling once the novelty wears off, because that's where most fantasy stories struggle. Wonder is one of the hardest emotions to sustain. It's easy to create, it's much harder to maintain. At the beginning of any fantasy story, everything feels mysterious. The audience doesn't know the rules, they don't understand the world. Every discovery feels significant, but over time, that changes. The audience learns the system, the unknown becomes the known, and magic often stops feeling magical. It becomes a tool, a mechanic, a piece of infrastructure. The story starts focusing on what magic can do rather than how it feels. This isn't necessarily bad. Many fantasy stories intentionally move in that direction, but it does mean they're delivering a different experience than the one they originally promised. And that's the trap Hat Atelier has to avoid. There's another story that came to mind while I was watching Coco on her journey. Not because they're similar plots, not because they share characters or settings, but because they chase the same feeling. That story is Spirited Away. Think about how that movie introduces its world. Almost nothing is explained. The bathhouse appears. Spirits appear. Rules exist. But nobody stops the story to hand the audience a guidebook. The movie trusts curiosity. It trusts that seeing something strange is often more powerful than immediately understanding it. And that's what Hat Atelier reminds me of. Not because it refuses to explain itself, but because it understands that explanation and wonder aren't opposites. They're partners. The audience learns just enough to stay oriented, just enough to feel grounded, but never enough to feel like they've reached the edge of the world. There's always another mystery, another possibility, another question. The world feels larger than the story currently being told, and that's exactly what made Spirited Away feel magical. The feeling that if you turned a corner, there might be an entirely different story waiting there. A place you've never seen, a character you'll never fully understand, a piece of the world that exists whether you're looking at it or not. That's an incredibly difficult feeling to create, and even harder to sustain, yet both stories manage it. Not through complexity, not through spectacle, but through restraint. By knowing when not to explain. Both stories understand something else as well. Wonder doesn't require safety. A lot of people remember Spirited Away as a comforting film. And in many ways it is. But it's also strange, sometimes unsettling. There are moments where Chihiro is completely out of her depth, moments where she doesn't understand the rules, moments where the world feels larger than she is. That uncertainty is part of what makes the wonder work. And Hat Atelier uses the same approach. The magical world isn't presented as perfect. There are dangers, there are secrets, there are people with very different ideas about how magic should be used. The world is beautiful, but it isn't simple. And that complexity makes every discovery feel more meaningful, because every answer comes with consequences. Every piece of knowledge carries weight. Wonder isn't just about finding something beautiful, it's about finding something bigger than yourself. What's fascinating about Hat Atelier is that it explains its magic system without destroying that wonder. Normally, these things work against each other. The more a system is explained, the less magical it feels. But here, every explanation creates new questions. Every answer reveals another layer. Every discovery expands the horizon instead of shrinking it. The story understands that wonder doesn't come from ignorance, it comes from possibility. The audience doesn't need everything to remain hidden. They just need to feel like there's always something more beyond what they've already seen. And that's exactly what the series continues to provide. Magic becomes understandable, but it never becomes ordinary. And there's another reason why this wonder works. A lot of fantasy stories accidentally make their worlds feel smaller over time. Everything important happens to the protagonist. Every mystery connects back to them. Every major character exists to help them. The world starts feeling less like a place and more like a stage built specifically for the main character. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't expand the world into its own universe. Hat Atelier avoids that trap. Even though Coco is our point of view character, the story constantly reminds us that she's entering a world that was already in motion long before she arrived. The other apprentices aren't simply there to support Coco's journey. Agathe carries the weight of proving herself, her magic shaped by pride, perfectionism, and the sting of past doubt. Etier approaches magic with open-hearted enthusiasm, eager to make people smile and feel comforted. Ritchie approaches it on her own terms, guarding the small, intricate style that's hers and hers alone. Each of them sees the magical world differently, and because of that, magic itself starts feeling larger, more personal, more complicated. The story isn't presenting a single answer to what magic means. It's showing us multiple perspectives. The same applies to the adults around them. Quiffrey isn't simply a mentor. He is a mystery. Every answer we get about him tends to create new questions. The more we learn, the more we realize there are entire parts of his life that remain hidden from us. And that's important. Because wonder comes from the feeling that there is always something more beyond the edges of the frame. The magical society reinforces this feeling. Its traditions feel old, its rules feel inherited. Its institutions feel like they existed long before Coco discovered them. Sometimes those rules seem wise, sometimes they seem frustrating, sometimes they seem outright questionable. But that's exactly what makes the world feel believable. Real societies are messy. They're built on old decisions layered on top of even older decisions. As Coco learns about the world, she begins to realize that understanding something isn't the same as agreeing with it, and that realization adds depth to the wonder. Because the world isn't magical simply because it's beautiful, it's magical because it feels alive. And that brings us to Coco herself. A lot of fantasy stories eventually outgrow their protagonists. The character becomes important, powerful, central to everything. And as that happens, the world starts revolving around them. The sense of discovery disappears, but Coco serves a very specific purpose. She's curious. She loves magic. That's her defining trait. Not strength, not destiny, not power. Curiosity. Curiosity about magic. She wants to understand it. And because her goals align perfectly with the audience's goals, every revelation feels natural. We're not learning information because the plot needs us to. We're learning information because she wants to. The story's promise of wonder survives because the protagonist never stops chasing it. And because she never stops asking questions, neither do we. This is where I think the series truly succeeds, because eventually every fantasy story faces the same test. The plot arrives, conflict escalates, secrets emerge, bigger stakes appear. The story has to decide what it's really about. Many fantasy stories begin with wonder and end with war, or politics, or saving the world. Again, those things aren't inherently bad, but they're often disconnected from the original appeal. Witch Hat Atelier takes a different approach, at least from what I can see. Its larger conflicts grow directly from the same ideas that created the initial sense of wonder. Questions about knowledge, questions about access, questions about who gets to learn, questions about what they're doing behind closed doors, and who gets to decide what remains hidden. The deeper the story goes, the more it reinforces the original promise rather than replacing it. Plot isn't competing with wonder. The plot is built from it. That's an important distinction, because a lot of fantasy stories accidentally create a divide between their premise and their plot. The premise is discovery. The plot becomes conflict. The premise is exploration. The plot becomes warfare. The premise is wonder. The plot becomes power scaling. Once that split happens, the audience starts to feel like they're watching a different story than the one they originally signed up for. I think Witch Hat Atelier avoids that problem. Even when the story becomes darker, it never stops asking the same questions that fascinated us in the beginning. The shape of the story changes, the heart of the story doesn't. As I watch Witch Hat Atelier, the thing that stands out most isn't any single element, it's alignment. Everything points towards the same promise. Nothing feels like it's pulling in a different direction. And that's surprisingly rare. A lot of stories have great pieces. Few stories have pieces that are all working towards the same goal. So in the end, do I think that Witch Hat Atelier kept its promise? I think it did. Not because every episode is perfect, not because every scene is flawless, but because it never forgets what made the journey special in the first place. It understands something that many fantasy stories eventually lose. Magic isn't really about power, it's about possibility. It's the feeling that the world is larger than you thought, that there are still secrets worth uncovering, still doors worth opening, still questions worth asking. And maybe that's why stories like Witch Hat Atelier resonate so strongly, not because they take us somewhere impossible, but because they remind us of something easy to forget. That wonder isn't something we outgrow, it's something we stop looking for. And for a little while, Witch Hat Atelier lets us look for it again. That's magic, and that's why it works.